Hello, I'm Terrence McNally. Welcome to Freeforum, a world that just might work. I'm going to be speaking today with JOANNA CHIU, a senior journalist for the Toronto Star and longtime correspondent in Beijing and around the world, about her first book, China Unbound, A New World Disorder, and you can learn more at joannachiu.com. That's JOANNACHIU.com. All one word, JOANNA CHIU. On Freeform, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at politics, economics, environment, science, health, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. The show airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA and on kpfk.org Thursdays at 3 p.m. Pacific. Streams weekly on the Progressive Voices Network on tunein.com. Podcasts are available anytime, anywhere on Apple Podcasts, Podomatic.com, most major podcast sites, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net. Let me lead off today with a couple of big questions I have about China. First, have we been such poor stewards of democracy, with money dominating politics and an inability to solve problems or promote the general welfare, that China will lead the world's response to climate change? For me, the most memorable exchange in an interview I did with Jared Diamond on his 2005 book Collapse was when we spoke of China's response to the devastating Yangtze floods of 1998. How devastating? More than 4,100 people were killed, 13.8 million were left homeless, and 240 million people directly affected by the rising waters, nearly equal to the U.S. population at the time. When authorities learned that the consequences were much worse due to erosion, and the erosion was largely the result of deforestation, they ordered an end to deforestation, and it stopped. I observed that in the U.S., even if it happened, it would take a few years to overcome the timber lobby. Well, not exactly a timber lobby in China. Despite the darkness of authoritarian rule, we both commented on the speed with which good or bad change could take place there. In the U.S., under Trump, we saw how in this country, even one person willing to oppose the popular consensus can dictate our nation's response to climate change. While in China, we see a big picture, long-term strategy to seize the leadership of the global response and reap the technological, economic, and political benefits. Authoritarianism has real advantages when confronting big problems that call for rapid pivots or mobilization. What FDR could do in the global emergency of World War II, China can do every day, and this is not a secret. I attended an event a few years ago where the sustainability plans for LA were talked about. One panel included someone talking about electric buses. He represented his company, BYD. Neither he nor anyone mentioned that it was a Chinese company or the fact that at the time, 99% of the electric buses in the world came from China. It looks to me that unless democracy, particularly in the U.S., becomes a more successful force for good in confronting climate change, China may well lead the word forward and hopefully save the planet in the process. But what that says to me is that even more at stake in our confrontation with climate change than the survival of human society, might it also determine how that human society organizes itself moving forward. By the way, climate change is just one of several critical crises we face that cannot be solved by one country alone. Others include our unhealthy relationship with the rest of nature, pandemics and public health, nuclear weapons, and technological disruption. Second big question, do we, and I mean the people, the policymakers, the pundits, appreciate the enormous difference between our geopolitical competition with the Soviet Union and later Russia and our relationship with China? They helped win World War II, and they long have had nuclear weapons, but the Soviet Union and Russia have never been an economic rival. They produce world-class achievements in science, sports, the arts, but have never developed the economic engine to rival the U.S. or the West. They are a petro and a military state. China also offers an authoritarian option. Like Russia, they have nuclear weapons and a huge military. The difference is China is an economic giant. Here's some numbers. In terms of GDP, the U.S. is number one with a GDP of $23 trillion. China, number two, $17.7 trillion. Japan, 3, down at $4.8 trillion. Germany, 4.2. the UK 3.2, India 3.2. That's your top 6. Russia is number 11, behind Canada and South Korea, with a GDP of 1.8 trillion. By the way, California would rank 5th above the UK and India. China is now expected to surpass the U.S. economy sooner than previously expected, as early as 2033. Unlike Russia, China is a major trading partner with neighboring countries and is tightly integrated with the rest of the world, including the U.S. A couple of years ago, I interviewed Branko Milanovic, presidential professor at the Graduate Center at CUNY, about his book, Capitalism Alone, The Future of the System That Rules the World, in which he makes the point that now there is only capitalism, liberal capitalism in the U.S., he calls it, and state or political capitalism exemplified by China. In over 25 years, I've seldom had conversations on this show focused on China. We've got a lot of catching up to do, and today's going to be a start. I will seek from today's guest her answers to at least some of the following questions. What is the current state of China economically, politically, socially, demographically, in terms of technology, human rights, health, nature, climate change? What's working in China and why is it working, and what's not working and why? How do the Chinese see themselves, the leadership and the people, the old and the young, men and women? In terms of how the West, the U.S. in particular, relates to China, what's working and what isn't? If our relationship with China is broken, what's the evidence? How did it get broken? How can it be fixed? We won't get to all of these, I assume, but the subject is huge and the book includes a great deal. History, politics, economics, sociology, religion, you get the idea. Now, I don't want to steal JOANNA CHIU's thunder, but because she does such a good job of setting the stage for our conversation, let me quote several lines from the book's introduction. This is JOANNA CHIU's words in the introduction to China Unbound. Many Westerners had accepted the idea that as China opened up to the world, things would get better. By the early 1980s, the People's Republic of China was introducing market reforms and establishing diplomatic ties with more countries. The communist world was gradually liberalizing its authoritarian systems and would soon become just like us. This was the assumption. The 1989 Tiananmen massacre of mostly young pro-reform protesters in Beijing shattered this hope. Yet, decades later, the myth of liberalizing China still persisted. Western leaders were optimistic. Bill Clinton, in a 2000 speech to the WTO, I'm quoting Clinton here, "The WTO agreement will advance the goals America has worked for in China for the past 3 decades. Membership in the WTO would not create a free society in China overnight or guarantee China would always play by global rules, but over time, China would move in the right direction," unquote. But the opposite happened. As China became richer, it became more authoritarian. The state retained significant control over its economy and mammoth state-owned enterprises under a philosophy called socialism with Chinese characteristics. Officials have returned to large-scale persecution of scholars, lawyers, artists, minorities. Targets include an estimated 1 million Uyghurs in internment camps. For far too long, Western societies have mishandled or simply ignored Beijing's actions out of narrow self-interest. Decades of willful misinterpretation have over time become complicity in the toxic diplomacy, human rights abuses, and foreign interferences in China engages in today. That's JOANNA CHIU's words from her introduction. JOANNA CHIU is a senior journalist for the Toronto Star. She served for years as a foreign correspondent for top European news agencies and the Associated Press. She's written for The Guardian, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, Newsweek, contributes to CBC, BBC, World, Al Jazeera, and NPR. Her story on refugees in Hong Kong won a Human Rights Press Award in 2012, and the book we're going to talk about is China Unbound, A New World Disorder. It's her first book. Welcome, JOANNA CHIU, to Free Forum, a world that just might work.
Oh, hi, Terrence. Thank you so much. I think that was probably the most detailed and most flattering intro I've gotten for any sort of book interview. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're very welcome. And let me tell listeners, we're recording this conversation Friday, September 30th. I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the ideas and the work that we talk about. So can you tell us a bit about your path? And you do in the book as well, because it's so interwoven with this.
Yeah.
But your path to the work you're doing today, and feel free to go way back, family, mentors, turning points, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I think one of the themes of my book that we need to see the political as personal and to see the human stories behind this web of geopolitics. So that's why I started the intro, just to tell people a bit about myself and why I was drawn to China, even though my parents immigrated to Canada from Hong Kong in the late 80s. My parents were actually one of the thousands of Hong Kongers who decided to leave the city, which they loved, after the 1989 Tiananmen massacre, where Chinese troops opened fire on peaceful pro-reform protesters. That's kind of been a black mark on, Chinese society, the Chinese diaspora, people in Hong Kong for sure. And my parents, I think, wanted to shield me from this really dark reality, and not just shielding from remembering or knowing what happened, but from Hong Kong's future. What would happen if China, when China was slated to take back Hong Kong from British colonial rule in 1997? A lot of people felt anxiety, uncertainty about it. It's very complicated. It's not as if this anxiety about Chinese rule meant that everyone in Hong Kong supported British colonial power. There was the kind of inequality we see in Hong Kong, that was set by the kind of often ruthless social policies of the British. It just shows this kind of long-standing uncertainty about China's rise. But like the quote, the excerpt you read out, ironically, just a few years really after 89, the massacre, the public opinion of Western leaders, some major influential ones like President Bill Clinton, really shifted towards optimism about how, as China got richer and got more integrated with the world economy, all of these kind of human rights issues will somehow just gradually resolve themselves. As they become richer, they'll become more like us, basically, just paraphrasing actually a speech from Clinton. So it's, quite interesting how it went from worldwide condemnation of 89 to this idea that, China should join the World Trade Organization. This will help. We don't want China to be a pariah state. Those arguments do, hold true in many ways today. But I guess what people failed to anticipate was that as China got richer, it became more confident. It cracked down further. And it started really because even in the past, even 10 years ago, when I first started studying Chinese history, 15 years ago or so, in university, Chinese diplomats would be diplomatic. Chinese diplomats would be polite to their counterparts. It's only been in the last around 5 or so years where we've seen this wolf warrior diplomacy from Beijing's representatives, where they're basically overreacting to any sort of offense by threatening, by mobilizing military exercises such as around Taiwan. By saying things like the Chinese ambassador in France telling French media that once Taiwan is reunified with China, Taiwanese people should be re-educated. So making those linkages to what China has done in Xinjiang, so-called re-educating thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs in these basically prisons. So suddenly, I think the world is waking up to the fact that China doesn't really care about whether the world condemns its human rights abuses, and that they continue to do such abuses. And in the last few years, some significant Westerners have been caught up. My country, Canada, had this kind of attitude to China that diplomats told me it was dual track. On one side, you pursue as much economic benefits as possible from China, and then on the other track, you do kind of try to do something about human rights, and somehow these tracks won't cross. But when Canadian authorities detained Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver in December 2018, that's when those paths crossed. That's when Canada, China, sunk into this crisis, because in retaliation, so-called retaliation, China detained two Canadian men, the two Michaels. Mm-hmm. And this really shocked Canadians, but it did not shock people like me, Chinese immigrants, because for years China has been treating Chinese immigrants of different foreign nationalities around the world as if we were fair game, that if someone, who was critical of China stepped foot in Chinese soil, that they would get arrested, get detained, get questioned. This kind of international harassment would target immigrant communities originally from China or Hong Kong or Macau or Taiwan for decades. But I wrote this book because I was kind of frustrated at this sudden realization that China's tactics were dangerous to not only Chinese people, but anyone, because it had been happening for a long time, and people have been warning about these tactics for a long time, especially among the global ethnic Chinese community who were aware of these things happening. So I wanted to tell these human stories, and because there's so much complexity, I thought a good way to do it was to do case studies. So this was before the pandemic, when I had just wrapped up my research. Yeah. So each chapter focuses on a different Western country, including the US, but the rest is mostly so-called middle powers: Canada, Italy, Greece, Australia, Turkey, to analyze how kind of the relations with China unraveled, where this realization came that they were dealing with something pretty difficult, or in some cases why, despite all these human rights issues, some Western countries wanted to try to keep getting as many economic benefits as possible from Beijing.
Yeah, when I was in the section that I read from your introduction, where you said that the Western countries had become complicit. I think what I was reading between the lines in that section was exactly what you just said, that Western countries wanting the economic benefits of China's ability to produce for them and be a trading partner had led them to blind themselves to what else was going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even what was going on in their own soil. So my research has uncovered that Chinese officials, police have been showing up literally on the doorsteps of people around the world to try to harass them, to curtail their free speech. There was a big kind of backlash when the pro-democracy protests were happening in Hong Kong a few years ago, and there were solidarity movements around the world.
Sure.
People told me that they received knocks on their doors, kind of threatening visits from people associated with Chinese embassy and police. And when they report these incidents to police, I've heard so many cases that local police have no idea what they're talking about, are not equipped to handle this. So a lot of these people feeling alone and vulnerable, and we see more self-censorship from these communities who are actually, I argue, are best positioned to help the West come up with better policies, foreign policies to do with China. But after all these years of being ignored, they feel like they feel vulnerable. They don't feel supported.
Yeah, this phenomenon that you're talking about, you say, is one of the real stimuli for you in terms of why you felt it was time for you to switch from reporting to writing a book and writing this book is the extra national security, if you will, or harassment. And I think that would be a surprise, as you have just said, but a real surprise to people. How does that even work? How does, one, you point out that the Chinese hold that anyone of Chinese descent is really still Chinese to them,
Yeah.
and owes allegiance or is liable sort of to the Chinese government and their rule. But how does this even happen? I mean, you've just described it. Someone from the Chinese police shows up in Canada or in some other country and knocks on your door. Um, Aside from the local police who go, "Oh, that makes no sense. I can't even believe that's happening. I have no way to deal with it." Don't other national governments, haven't they woken up to this?
So part of the book was like I wanted to see for myself. So I actually went to all sorts of places around the world, including Australia, like all over, and in varying degrees. But I haven't seen any country with a plan in place. I haven't spoken to any Chinese immigrant community that said that they felt supported and understood and that people are taking these things seriously. After the book came out and I had these critiques of Western responses, governments reached out to me. I had meetings with them and I thought they were going to tell me what they were going to do, but they wanted me to tell them what I found. um, so I'm like, in a way, I'm like, I think the intent and the good intentions are there now, all over the world. But they admit that they have been very slow getting these conversations even started. One government said, "Oh, we're reaching out finally to our ethnic Chinese community for consultations." I'm like, "Oh, this is 2022, and you're reaching out to talk, and shouldn't you be talking to this large part of your population in the past about these issues?" But yeah, it is. I think it is. It's amazing how much has changed, how that narrative that Chinese human rights issues are important to advocate for, but they mostly affect Chinese people in
Sure.
China. That was pretty dominant for a very, very long time. The main goal of governments, including Canada, including the US, was to, work with China as an economic partner.
Yeah. Yeah. So on one hand, I would say congratulations. When a book has an effect not just on its readers but on policymakers, that's a big deal. And so I first of all I congratulate you on
Thank
that.
you.
I mean, as you say, it shouldn't have taken my book to wake them up, but if it did, that's good. What is a Chinese person in another country, or a person of Chinese descent, or a Chinese immigrant, however we describe them? What is their fear when they're harassed by folks from China?
Yeah, so one of the main tactics that are the most effective is that a lot of people still have family
Uh huh.
in Greater China, or business connections. Family, business, those are the main ways that Beijing tries to control free speech and actions abroad. And not just to have people be quiet and shut up, but also to act proactively to try to interfere, meddle in democracies around the world. I've spoken to people who say quite frankly that I talk to students. They tell me they know they're being monitored. So sometimes when they think they're being monitored, there's someone literally in the classroom with them. They're going to stand up and say something that's quite patriotic to China.
Oh,
They might shoot down and be vocal against Hong Kong, against Uyghur human rights in Xinjiang. It's almost like this kind of a pragmatic thing to do.
well, it's interesting that links for me to the other thing I was going to say. Not only are the Chinese harassing people from the country of China harassing Chinese descendants in other countries, but the other countries, in response and paranoia to China's growing aggression, their human rights abuses, their thought of being a threat
Mm-hmm.
have made it much harder on Chinese students and Chinese
Mm-hmm.
people. Talk about that. That's sort of
Yeah.
like it's like it's the worst of both worlds.
Yeah, it's like the opposite of being productive. Um, we've seen around the world, COVID exacerbated it because it happened to originate in China, and their original cover up was from Chinese authorities, and it was Chinese doctors and citizens who were whistleblowing and trying to warn the world about this serious flu like disease. But instead, we had elderly Asian men beat up, we had people have acid attacks. It was just, I can't, describe how terrifying it is, having older parents here in the West, that people were lashing out against Asians indiscriminately. Here, there was an indigenous teenager who was punched in the face, and someone said, you Chinese, you did this. And she was indigenous, so it's not very well informed, this violence. But not just physical violence on the streets. There's been, especially in the U.S., I found this
Yes.
closing in and treating of people of Chinese descent with suspicion. I spoke with someone who works formerly in the Defense Department, and pretty much every day she would say people would joke that she was a Chinese spy. In order to get security clearance, she had to jump through more hoops because the suspicion was that she was compromised somehow. And yeah, she had to deal with that suspicion constantly throughout her career, and that ultimately, I think, pushed her out of working for government.
But the other thing that I saw, and it goes more with the second case you're talking about, is universities turning on the government
Mm-hmm.
or
Yes,
universities themselves turning on graduate students or
yes,
researchers
yes.
over here. Talk about that, because and I don't know where that stands today.
So this happened mostly under Trump. He told a closed door meeting that he felt basically all Chinese students were spies. His government canceled or reduced many visas of students. And that's indiscriminately with no kind of transparent process on how they were exactly screening or vetting people or deciding why they were going to reduce. And in addition to that, the Justice Department in the U.S. had something called a China Initiative, which has since been, winded down because of how problematic it was. There are so many investigations and prosecutions, a vast majority of which turned out to be nothing. These scholars, Chinese scholars mostly, who were investigated. But then damage was done. People lost their jobs. Some people were suspended like for years. It depended on how much the university wanted to support them. Some did. Some just, turned their backs on them. And it was so hostile. And actually, it is a stereotype that people of Asian descent are in the sciences and STEM.
Yeah.
But it is the case that they, contribute a lot to global
Yeah.
research, medicine, especially when we're in a pandemic. You want those nerds in lab coats not being worried about just random suspicion that they're Chinese spies. So it is kind of like as this competition grew between the U.S. and China, ordinary people, like in the past, like during the actual Cold War. Some people say there's what we have now is like a second Cold War,
Mm-hmm.
but during the actual official Cold War, these people suffered. Ordinary people always suffered when ties between the kind of powers were tense. And I argue that's so counterproductive because if we wanted to support China, going in the direction of better human
Exactly.
rights.
I was just going to say, Joanna, on the one hand, for decades, they thought their engagement, in
Mm-hmm.
quotes, was going to moderate China.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they take people who actually are really engaged in the U.S., not just
Mm-hmm.
doing business, but
Mm-hmm.
really engaged, and turn against them when in fact these are the young people who might
Mm-hmm.
actually have some possibility of having some
Yeah,
influence when they get back home.
of course. It's always a people to people exchanges and not like, um, it is what is important. Yeah,
Yeah,
it
and
is really too
the other thing,
bad.
a point you make many times, I certainly, looked in the mirror and said how upset we are when during the Trump administration, if someone were to assume that all Americans agreed with what we were doing, like that all Americans thought we should leave
Hmm. Yeah.
the climate agreement, and all Americans thought we should leave the Iran nuclear agreement, etc.,
Hmm.
and all agreements hated immigrants. Um, what you say is that many people act as if all Chinese agree with Z and the CCP leadership, when in fact they don't even elect him. I mean, Trump
Yeah.
was elected by electoral
Yeah.
college, but you know,
Hmm. Yeah. China's not a democracy.
yeah. How could you
So,
possibly think that the people are to blame for what the leadership is doing?
yeah, I think it's because China, in a way, is almost convenient for some politicians.
Mm-hmm.
If they're pledging to be tough on China, if they seem really strong, that kind of appeals to patriotism among voters in America and elsewhere. And it doesn't matter if they're not really well versed in the issues or they don't really have a very concrete plan. Um,
It's just
it
talking
sounds
tough.
good. Yeah,
Yeah.
in the Beltway, people tell me it's almost like a competition on who can be more hawkish on China.
Yeah.
It's if you say anything kind of measured, you get shot down. You get that suspicion. Even if you're a white person, you'd be like, "Oh, are you a CCP supporter? Or are you a communist?" I've been called a communist when I write something that's not like all doomsday. People say, "Oh, you're a CCP stooge,"
Oh
and
my
it's
God.
become very polarized and simplified. And really, that's like my main message. Like, we need, if you want to be smart, if you want to in a way show that democracy is a dominant and you know preferred system, you have to go higher. You need to be better informed, more nuanced. And like you said, there are major world issues like climate change where we need to engage with Beijing about China and US are the two world's largest polluters. And I would say that since the world has a lot of manufacturing in China, it's not just China's fault that it's such a major polluter because its factories are producing all of this stuff for us.
That's right.
Looking around just my desk right now, I'm sure most of these objects are made in China.
Yeah.
So it's a global issue, and I think what a silver lining is
Oh.
silver lining analyzing Chinese state documents and other things. There's not the sense that they want to kind of burn down the world's institutions. They don't want to dissolve the UN and the World Banks or anything like that. They're actually quite eager to play a bigger role in world organizations. They kind of I try to explain the history of humiliation that they
Mm-hmm.
felt by Western powers. They kind of want to show, the world and also a lot of the domestic Chinese audience that they can be powerful in existing post World War II global institutions. So there's opportunities to engage and have these kind of negotiations. But when you're coming at it with just not a lot of knowledge of China and lashing out at the people who could be your consultants, who are have that Chinese cultural background and language skills, you're not very well equipped to take best advantage of any kind of diplomatic openings to make, for example, steps towards kind of global action on fighting climate change.
Yeah, we're going to talk
But
more about
yeah,
climate change. Let me tell people this is Free Forum, a world that just might work. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with JOANNA CHIU. She's a senior journalist for the Toronto Star, has been a correspondent in China for many years, and now in Canada. And we're talking about China and about her first book, which really, if you want to, I mean, the way I viewed it was a chance for me to begin to get up to speed on China. She does deal with the history. She does deal with transitions in the politics. She does deal with demographics, with culture, and so on. So, as well as looking at the current moment and the current conflicts, you will get yourselves a good deal of background. The book is called China Unbound, A New World Disorder, and you can learn more at JOANNACHIU.com. That's JOANNACHIU, all one word.com.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, let me just go back to what you were just saying, which I think was fascinating to me. I wasn't quite clear on this one, which was that Xi himself, Xi Jinping, in a big speech, said, we do not want to oppose the UN, oppose the WTO, replace the current organizations. It's not destroy what's out there. What we want is for you to accept that an authoritarian government, although he doesn't phrase it that way, a dictatorship, mm-hmm. although he doesn't phrase it that way, mm-hmm. but a different kind of government is mm-hmm. on equal footing. Don't bug me, and again, of course, I'm paraphrasing, about my human rights abuses. Just let us play together in the world economy and the world's mm-hmm. structures.
Yeah, that is the idea that China is trying to redefine the idea of democracy, and they use the word democracy in its speech, in Xi's speeches and State Department, Chinese State Council documents. But their idea of democracy is equality between nations, regardless of regime type. If you are, a dictator or not, you deserve equal footing at the UN and other places. And that's interesting, and it's important to understand.
Yes.
It's important to understand how that is appealing to people around the world, to China's allies in different places, that they like this idea. So not to come at it with this idea of arrogance that, that's absurd, that's silly, looking at how China is getting momentum for
and don't expect that if you say that's absurd that everyone will mm-hmm. agree with you either.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating what they're saying in a way, as you say, because first you say, well, how could that be democracy? But they're almost saying democracy among countries, not among citizens, mm-hmm. right? That it's countries. Their definition of democracy is countries can meet as equals. Our citizens don't get a voice in it, but that countries can, which I think is a very mm-hmm. weird, since demos is not about countries, demos is about people. Mm-hmm. Let me. We will get to climate change. We will get to a couple of other things, but if you could just a little bit, give people a brief primer on where Chinese is right now in terms of economics, demographics. Kind of if you had to do like a 5-minute, what's the state of China right now, apart from the things we've already talked about, which is persecution, protests, those sorts of things. What's mm-hmm. just, most people don't know.
Mm-hmm. It's very complicated.
Of course.
And I think China is in a precarious place right now. I haven't lived in China for several years, but try to keep up with people who had just recently left or who do live there, if there are opportunities to speak safely. People tell me there's a running away movement from China, especially among young professionals. COVID-0 has really traumatized them. People talk to me about calling their parents in Shanghai, and they were saying they were fine because, Chinese people had this kind of stoic, they tend to have this kind of stoic, oh, I'm fine kind of mentality, but, they're actually crying. Someone's father lost 10 kilos while under lockdown because people weren't allowed to leave their homes. And this happened suddenly as COVID cases spread in cities like Shanghai. Some people did not have supplies. And there were delays with government aid. This really, really, I think, has shocked a lot of people in and outside China, and has strengthened the resolve of many young people in China to try to leave. But now, as they're leaving, they're facing, racism, discrimination, suspicion from around the world. If you're mainland Chinese, you're aligned with Xi Jinping. But a lot of people are desperate to leave. They don't see a good future for them. They're unhappy a lot of them are unhappy with how harsh the lockdowns were. They might not disagree with the importance of trying to control COVID because China's hospital system is quite limited in how many beds it
Oh.
can provide for
Mm-hmm.
1.4 billion people. I
Mm-hmm.
definitely, one of these, I tried to get a routine test at a Chinese hospital, and I lined up in 5 different lineups all day, and I had to leave without getting the test done because
Mm.
it was just way too crowded. So there's reasons for COVID zero, but that plus all of these rules, entrepreneurs feel like they are so saddled with basically Chinese Communist Party rules that needed to have like CCP cells in their
Mm.
offices. They're very curtailed with how they can access the internet, how they can store data. They feel like they have no hope of trying to expand their business in China, let alone around the world, and convince people around the world that they are trustworthy. And that, yeah, so people feel like it's come to a point where the government restrictions on their everyday life, especially young professionals, they feel fed up. They feel that even though they avoid getting involved in any sort of political sorry, I repeat that. Young people feel that they're fed up, even if they are so careful not to involve themselves in any sort of political activity. If they're just trying to live their lives, they come up against so many restrictions. So they want to leave. But if they find themselves in the West, then they're facing discrimination, suspicion that they are actually supporting Beijing. So it's a pretty tough situation for
And
the average.
what about the economy? There was an article in the Guardian in the last couple of days. A Ponzi scheme by any other name is still a Ponzi scheme about the fact that much of the or a significant percentage of the ongoing economic growth in China was in construction, and and some of that was not real, if you will, and the huge problems in that arena and its impact in the economy.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing that the whole world is in economic turmoil right now,
Yeah.
what's going on in China economically?
Yeah, China's been locked down very tightly since the pandemic, so I think it is struggling. And that's why, as I think a good indication that the economy is not doing well is that on the politics side, there's a greater crackdown. The tendency of the government is when they see signs of instability that they will try to, not like use as many carrots, but lately more sticks to try to like keep things under control at the same time to really embolden and foster nationalist sentiment in China. But that also has a runaway phenomenon actually when U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi landed in Taiwan
Mm-hmm.
for a visit that enraged China. They had all of this before her visit, state propaganda about what they would do to protest and respond to her visit. And then when nothing happened, when China's army did not invade,
Mm.
actually, all of this nationalism that they stirred up did kind of bite them back. Actually, there was a rare outpouring of mocking of the Chinese army,
Mm.
mocking of Chinese authorities for being all bark and no bite. And letting Pelosi in the U.S. get away with it.
Mm.
And then we saw these giant military exercises, the largest ever in
Yeah.
Taiwan. So it sounds like not a good situation in China right now for the management. And Xi Jinping is pursuing, I think next month, an unprecedented third term in this constitution change that he passed when I was last in China, that he could rule for life, that
Mm-hmm.
party secretary could rule for life. So he has a lot at stake. He's basically trying to even further solidify his power and legitimacy at this time of all of these economic problems and pressures, and so much pressure from Chinese citizens to relax the COVID zero lockdown policies.
Okay. Let me talk just a little about climate change. And my question, and it's been haunting me for a while, is without trying to be a uh, an anti-China person, was the one I raised in the introduction. Have we been such poor stewards of democracy, with money dominating our politics, the fossil fuel industry have inordinate power to delay action or avoid action, and I would say now it's sort of delay and disable real needed action, and so thus an inability to solve problems, that China will end up leading the world's response to climate change. And let me just give people a little bit of information. In 2018, China invested more in solar capacity than every other country combined. For every dollar the United States invested in renewable energy, China invested 3. It developed the world's largest electric vehicle industry in basically 5 years. At the same time, over 1/4 of all the world's carbon emissions come from China. China consumes as much coal as all other countries combined. Its coal consumption is the largest single source of CO2 emissions on the planet. And in June of 2017, Barbara Finnemore, who used to run the NRDC office in China, author of Will China Save the Planet, wrote, by recklessly withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, Trump has ceded the race for global leadership to China. And a wise person, then I can't remember who it was, I heard it quoted by Kevin Phillips, but that world leadership shifts with the major source of energy. Holland, when it was wind, Portugal, then Italy, and that all in the age of wind, Britain in the age of steam, U.S. in the age of oil. Will it be China in the age of renewables? Mm-hmm. Your thoughts about that kind of question?
So can you rephrase the last part of it?
Well, it's that if, because of the inefficiencies of democracy versus the efficiency of authoritarianism, if China is really ends up being the savior of the planet in terms of, or the leader of dealing with climate change, what might that do in terms of democracy and authoritarianism?
Mm-hmm. I think we'll see that play out, and to be honest, I think that's probably going to be a subject of my future research and writing. Maybe I'll come back to on a podcast when I have more answers for you. Yeah, I think it underscores that nothing can be like North Korea, where we can't put China into this kind of pariah status, but some argue that the U.S. is trying to do so with all of these tariffs, forcing companies to choose whether to work with the U.S. or with China. But when it comes to the climate, there's no way around having to work with China. And I think it is actually great to see that Beijing is seeing climate as a priority. Again, I go back to all of the pressures domestically. I lived in Beijing. I wore a mask almost every day, and I wore an N95 before COVID actually ever happened. I was very accustomed to wearing a mask in my daily activities because otherwise I might, give myself cancer walking around in the smog. And that's when you talk to ordinary Chinese people, the pollution is a major reason why they're dissatisfied with the government and that they want to leave China. So the CCP knows this. They know that part of their legitimacy to continue to rule depends on how they fight climate change. Authorities, when I was there, talked about this war on pollution, that they were going to do something about it. And, they have. Beijing has gotten more and more blue sky days, it's called. Whereas here in the West, we have more and more wildfire days because of climate change. Actually, when I left Beijing late 2018, in the late summer of 2018, Beijing had a whole suite of good days, and I was, in AQI 800 because there were these crazy wildfires. So it's good that China cares, but I think it's more I think the framing should be more, how can political differences and competition and maybe even war affect our efforts to try to save the planet and ourselves. It's almost, there's two things happening at once, and what's happening politically can really affect what achievements we do see.
Yeah, as we all know, the thing that brings people together is a common enemy. And so while you can, these politicians who are trying to be hawkish on China are trying to use that to bring their people together, but the common enemy is climate change. And I'd also say nuclear weapons, and I'd say pandemics, and I'd say technological disruption. All of those are common things that we have to join together to do. Let me just say, you've said you've got to leave soon. Until you leave, if you could sit down with Biden or the leading, American folks, what would you tell them about, given all that we've talked about, what needs to change, and how would you advise them?
I would say, and I have said actually to U.S. Officials, that you need to talk to the people who are most knowledgeable on China and try to avoid this conflation in U.S. Official rhetoric that has a risk of conflating Chinese people with the Chinese state, because this can deter really, really smart people and well-known people in the know to get involved to help in this very crucial, pivotal point we are in right now to help governments navigate a very, very tricky relationship with China. So you need to involve these people in this work. And I think the direction is getting there. People are realizing just closing off and treating everyone with suspicion is not a smart way to do it. I also say that language skills, Chinese reading and writing and speaking ability is so important. A lot of the stories I've been able to do and break as a reporter is because I can read Chinese, even though far from perfectly, like I am a learner. Because the information is out there, you get a way better and bigger picture when you can actually read in Chinese. But in this climate of suspicion, universities have closed down their Chinese language programs and have not expanded them. And that doesn't,
makes no sense.
Makes no sense if we want to have like a generation of, well-informed international policymakers. So language and I think welcoming people of the global Chinese community to get involved is kind of two. It sounds simple, but I think they will make such a big difference.
Yeah, it's interesting what they held on to, as we've talked about it a few times, of this engagement model. Now we need that engagement to solve our mutual problems, even if that engagement does not have the effect of moderating their internal politics. Right? I mean, that's really what we need is when you got a common problem, you got to engage and you got to give up the short-term local advantage of rhetoric for actually doing what might solve the planet's problems. Thank you, Joanna Chiu. Keep up your good work.
Thank you so much, Terrence.
So again, the book is China Unbound, A New World Disorder, and the website is joannachiu.com. JOANNACHIU, all one word. For this conversation and many other interviews and articles, to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to terrencemcnally.net, TERRENCEMCNALLY.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website. If you want to receive my weekly email announcement telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, plus probably 10 articles that I choose each week to flesh out the conversation, sign up at my site or email me at temcnally, TEMCNALLY, at mac.com. You can also subscribe and listen to the Freeform podcast on Apple Podcasts and most other podcast sites. You'll find years of podcasts at my site and at most of those sites. Listen anytime, anywhere. Archives include Michael Lewis, Naomi Klein, Bill McKibben, Van Jones, Connie Rice, Greg Boyle, George Packer, and on and on. You can also follow me on Twitter at McNally Terrence, McNallyTerrence. Thanks to Kiana Williams in production, George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices, and most of all, to you, my listeners. Please share this podcast widely. And finally, thank you, Joanna Chiu. Keep up your good work.